Like the office they commemorate, presidential libraries are living institutions. Certainly it is my hope that the Reagan Library will become a dynamic intellectual forum where scholars interpret the past and policymakers debate the future.
Welcome to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute's virtual event series. To fulfill President Reagan's mission of making the Reagan Library a dynamic intellectual forum, our Center for Public Affairs programming offers lectures and forums presenting perspectives on important public policy issues of the day. Each year we bring you 20 to 30 events from politicians, authors, members of the media, business and military leaders, and more. During the 2020 closure of many businesses across our great country due to COVID-19, the Reagan Foundation switched to virtual programming to ensure that we were still delivering world-class content, even if you couldn't get to our hilltop to watch it in person. Now that the Reagan Library Museum is back open, we are holding hybrid programming, whereby some are in person and some are virtual. We hope you enjoyed this virtual event. In this week's Center for Public Affairs virtual event, we bring you a conversation with internet pioneer Steve Case for his latest book, The Rise of the Rest: How Entrepreneurs in Surprising Places Are Building the New American Dream, which shows how entrepreneurs across the country are building groundbreaking companies, renewing communities, and creating new jobs. Steve Case rose to fame when, in 1985, he co-founded America Online. Under his leadership, AOL became the world's largest and most valuable internet company, helping to drive the worldwide adoption of a medium that has transformed businesses and societies. AOL was the first internet company to go public and one of the best performing stocks of the 1990s. For the past 15 years, Steve Case's focus has been on starting and scaling Revolution, the Washington, D.C. based investment firm that now backs entrepreneurs at every stage of their development. His Rise of the Rest seed fund has invested in more than 130 startups in over 70 U.S. cities, in partnership with many of America's most successful entrepreneurs and investors. Kirkus Review said of The Rise of the Rest, inspiring stories from unexpected places, showing that the entrepreneurial spirit is alive and kicking. We now invite you to enjoy our virtual program with Steve Case, joined in conversation by Reagan Foundation and Institute Executive Director John Heybusch.
We are so honored to have Steve Case with us today, which the world knows as the co-founder of America Online. And you've been really busy over the years since the merger with Time Warner, and the books that you've done, Steve, are just a treasure. We had the honor of having you here at the Reagan Library just a few years ago for this one, The Third Wave, and that was terrific to read that book. But this one, I think, even tops it, The Rise of the Rest. And Steve, the first question I've got for you is, you're one of the world's greatest entrepreneurs, but you've spent so many of the recent years not entrepreneuring for your own benefit and for yourself, but actually encouraging entrepreneurship across America. Why is that?
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you, John, again. And we've been doing things together now for 2 decades, and it's great to be part of a Reagan Library program, even though I'm sorry we're not doing it in person. Hopefully I'll be able to visit in the not too distant future. But the answer to the question is, and Ronald Reagan said this, that one of the great things about America is this pioneering spirit. 250 years ago, we were a startup nation, almost didn't make it. Now we're the leader of the free world with the leading economy because of the work of pioneering entrepreneurs who first kind of led the charge with the agricultural revolution, then led the charge with the industrial revolution, and more recently led the charge with the technology revolution. That's why we're such a strong nation. And we have to continue to be backing the next generation of entrepreneurs if we're going to continue to be the most innovative entrepreneurial nation in the world. And part of my view is you need to do that not just in a few places that get a lot of attention and get most of the capital, like Silicon Valley or New York City or Boston. You really need to do that all over the country. You need to level the playing field so everybody who has an idea, wants to be an entrepreneur, wants to create a company, has the ability to do that, really has the ability to pursue the American dream. So that's why I've been doing this. It's a great way to give back the next generation of entrepreneurs. We invest in them, we mentor them, we champion them. And in the process, we've also been championing dozens of cities around the country that are showing really remarkable promise in terms of what's happening in their startup community. But most people don't know it. So that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah, neat. Now, Steve, one of the reasons I was so pleased to read this book is because the premise of your book mirrors a theory that I've had for many years, and I think perhaps you're in agreement with it, albeit from a different perspective. Let me explain. I've always felt that the problems associated with so many of the cities on the coast, whether it be rising crime rates, high cost of living, high taxation, all those things, that they would one day drive people fed up with those issues towards the interior and to lower cost of living and perhaps more peaceful neighborhoods and this sort. So I kind of saw it as problems on the coast push people inward. But I think your point in the book is that it's not just problems on the coast, but there is opportunities in flyover country. Explain that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting if you look at the last few decades of the history around innovation, around entrepreneurship. Sadly, many parts of the country, including most cities in the middle of the country, didn't really have a strong ecosystem to support startups, didn't really have the venture capital, for example, that most entrepreneurs need if they have an idea to turn it into a company and the process, create jobs and economic growth and so forth. So as a result, there was a brain drain. A lot of people in the middle of the country felt like they had to go to the coast. Action was in Silicon Valley, for example. And so there was sort of a hollowing out of some of the communities. And what we said even 10 years ago, we started this, we need to slow that brain drain of people leaving and create a boomerang of people returning. And the only way you can do that is if in these places all across the country, not just a few places, but a few dozen cities, really emerge as strong, supportive startup ecosystems. And so we're starting to see that happen. It was building over the last decade. Certainly the pandemic has been kind of a tipping point. There are definitely more people who are rethinking how they work and how they live and where they work and where they live, and even the ability to more flexible options, more remote options is fueling an acceleration of these rise of the rest cities. But at the core, it has to come down to opportunity. And I'm just gratified that so many cities now, including the mayors as well as governors of so many states, CEOs of those companies, university presidents, if they have a big university in that city, recognize in part their future of their community is what new companies are started by entrepreneurs and how do they support creating a more vibrant ecosystem. There's still great things about places like Silicon Valley. I'm not negative Silicon Valley. I'm actually very bullish on Silicon Valley. It will continue to be the leader of the pack in terms of startup ecosystems, not just in this country but around the world. But we need to level the playing field. We need to make sure there are dozens of other places, people who have dreams, who have ideas, who have a desire to really build a company can start and scale those companies. The last point I'll make is, and this was the data that I realized about a decade ago really got me focused on this. Two things that I hadn't fully appreciated. One is that while small business accounts for a lot of jobs and very important, it doesn't account for a lot of net new jobs. If a restaurant, for example, goes out of business and replaced by a new restaurant, it will employ about the same number of people. So very, very important as a sector, but not a big, kind of job creating sector. And the other one that was sort of surprising is big companies, the Fortune 500 as a sector does not create jobs. Sure, there's some companies that are growing rapidly, but there's also Fortune 500 companies that are declining. And as a sector, it doesn't really account for a lot of net new jobs. The sector that really drives it are new companies less than 5 years old, startups, not just tech startups, many forms of startups. So we need to back more of these new companies. And then the second piece that was a surprise to me 10 years ago is I had a sense of this, but I didn't have a sense of the magnitude of it. Over the past decade, 75% of venture capital has gone to just 3 states, California, New York, and Massachusetts. So the other 47 states are fighting over the remaining 25%. And as you know, even within those states, it's overwhelmingly a few cities. San Francisco within California, New York City within New York, Boston within Massachusetts. So our innovation economy is shockingly limited or centered in a few places. And as a result, we're not getting the benefit of this economic growth, job creation all across the country. As a result, a lot of people are feeling kind of left out and left behind. Sure. And so how do we address that as well?
Sure. These dozens of cities in the interior, Steve, what do you sense are the key ingredients that characterize a city having the promise so that startups can succeed there?
Well, it starts with an attitude, kind of looking towards the future, being optimistic about the future. Again, something that Ronald Reagan was so great at. It also is building a more collaborative community, trying to get everybody working together to support these entrepreneurs, to support these new companies. So the big companies, as well as the universities, the mayors, nonprofits that are focused on kind of startup support organizations. They all have a role to play, and they generally need to be more connected and more collaborative. The capital piece, of course, is important. How do you get some of that early stage seed capital to get these companies going? Most of that capital usually comes from the local area. So how do you educate people about the need and the benefits of backing these companies and make it easier for them to be supportive? And then figuring out the right way to tap into the expertise that is unique to that particular city. One of the great things about this country is there's a lot of expertise around healthcare, or around farming, or around financial services, or around trucking and logistics, or you can name many others. How do you build on the strengths of each city in the country so that they can kind of lean into the future and bring a reimagined view of what that industry can be? So some of it's around collaboration, some of it's around capital, some of it's around leveraging that strategic domain expertise. And then the last piece that I mentioned earlier is this talent thing. How do you make sure you're a magnet for talent, so people want to kind of, instead of leaving your community, want to come to your community and be part of building a brighter community?
Yeah, sure. With the recent pandemic, Steve, the great revelation upon many companies was, oh my gosh, space is not really all that important in the sense that a lot of these companies, they're fully capable of operating with people, some working from home some of the time, all of the time. It really changed the picture. And I wonder if it's that you think it's also the case that revelation had people not only looking towards people's homes, but actually towards the Midwest. And, if place was no longer that important, the Midwest all of a sudden became territory that might be ripe for development.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we saw some of this prior to the pandemic, but it certainly accelerated during the pandemic. And it was sort of interesting, even the early days of the internet. And I was certainly involved in the really early days when America Online started, AOL started in 1985. Only 3% of people were online, and those 3% were online an average of 1 hour a week. So it was pretty early days. As finally the internet took off and really became much more of a mainstream phenomenon, people said even 20 years ago, well, that really will give people flexibility to kind of work wherever they want. But the reality is there was only a few places like a Silicon Valley where people aggregated around innovation, and that's where most of the money is. That's where most of the venture capital was. So even though technologically it was possible, practically it wasn't. And that's what's been changing over the last few years. And that's really why I decided to write the book, because I spent the better part of the last decade traveling around the country, visiting dozens and dozens of cities, meeting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of entrepreneurs. It's remarkable what's happening all across the country, but most people only pay attention to what's happening in a few places on the coast, most in terms of media attention, in terms of investor attention. And what we're trying to do here is change some of that dynamic, tell some of the stories, not just of these entrepreneurs, but also these cities, how they're being reimagined. And as a result, they're starting to move forward with more hope and optimism.
Yeah, and one of the phenomena I thought that was really interesting that you pointed to, Steve, it ties to some of my own experience in the late 80s, early 90s with the company you did a lot of business with, Gateway Computers. And when we were growing beyond, the headquarters that we need, we made the move eventually out to the West Coast. But I remember we looked really hard at Silicon Valley as a potential for our headquarters. And one of the downsides we saw was that as soon as you move there, your talent becomes fair game for every other company. And if somebody wants a new job, they can just walk across the street. And I think you pointed out that the Midwest it insulates itself from that kind of a problem, right?
Yeah, Silicon Valley is hyper competitive. I do remember gateway. I believe started in Iowa, then shifted a lot of the center of gravity to South Dakota, and was one of the most successful personal computer companies in that time frame. And they were a great partner of AOL. And then with your help, Ted Waite was a great partner on some of our philanthropic initiatives over the years. So that's a great American success story. At some point, you said the sense was you did need to move to Southern California to access the next phase of talent and capital. What we're hoping will happen in the next 10 or 20 years is that will be less common, that you really can start and scale wherever you are. And we've seen more and more examples of that. There's two companies we backed in Detroit, for example. One called Chinola, which makes watches, another called StockX, which is sort of a stock exchange for things where you can authenticate the products to make sure they're real. Neither of those companies existed just 10 years ago. Both now have well over 1,000 employees in Detroit. In the process are really kind of reimagining Detroit, which is a city that had a glorious history 100 years ago. In many ways, Detroit was Silicon Valley because the car was the technology that everybody wanted to be part of 100 years ago. But then had some decline, lost about half its population. And then actually the year before we arrived with our Rise the Rest bus, the city of Detroit went bankrupt. So it shows you that these things can rise, but also fall. Thankfully, a city like Detroit is on the rise again because of companies like that. There's another company outside of Madison, Wisconsin called Epic that's the leader in the country around health technology, specifically focused on electronic medical records. I think they have now more than 10,000 employees outside of Madison, Wisconsin. So there are more and more of these examples of companies being able to scale. And going back to your earlier point, in this more remote work, partly accelerated by the pandemic, some of the people you need that have experience kind of growing these companies to scale, you can now tap into and have them work remotely if they don't want to move there, to your city permanently, as opposed to feeling like you have to move to one of the coasts to continue to grow. Yeah,
sure. Tell me, there's always been this famous Midwest work ethic. And I wonder is that apocryphal, Steve, or you think it's really there?
No, I think it's definitely there. There's definitely certainly hardworking, humility, at the same time, real optimism in terms of what's possible. And back to your point, there is also some loyalty where people tend to stay with things longer. And even during the pandemic, while some of the firms on the coast saw most people working remotely, a lot of the companies that we've backed in many cities around the country, most people were working, pretty much every day, or at least most days. They saw the value of being together in a community. I was in Fayetteville, Arkansas just a couple of weeks ago. There's a company there called Acre Trader that we backed. They have 150 employees, and most of them were in the office. And that's a great story because the founder of that company, Carter Malloy, actually was in San Francisco working for a hedge fund. And he came up with this idea of creating essentially a trading platform so people could invest in farmland. And he said that would allow investors to diversify their holdings and also allow farmers to have a choice, and maybe they can raise some capital to invest in their farm, new technologies, things like that, as opposed to sometimes feeling like they have to sell their farm because they don't have the ability to do that. So he launched his company, Acre Trader, moved to Fayetteville, Arkansas, because he said, if I'm going to be successful with this company, I need to get the farmers to trust me. Need to get the farmers to put their land on the platform. So that's an example of what's happening in these Rise the Rest cities. Instead of feeling like the place you had to build that was in San Francisco, where Carter already was, he decided to move to Arkansas, and that company is growing quite rapidly.
Yeah, sure. I think I read in your book, Steve, that you started off with like an initial tranche in this seed fund of about $150 million, and then second tranche of another $150 million. So you have $300 million at work. Is there like an average size investment that the fund would make that a company could expect?
Yeah, the strategy we have different parts of Revolution, my investment company. We have a later stage growth fund called Revolution Growth and a venture fund called Revolution Ventures. But for Rise the Rest specifically, we have this early stage seed fund, as you mentioned, about $300 million so far. And we've made about 200 investments in 100 different cities all around the country. And so we're really seeing a diverse mix of cities. And generally, our initial check is in the few $100,000 side alongside others. We want to partner with regional venture firms, and we partner now with over 300 regional venture capitalists and work with them to help these companies get to the next stage. And then we obviously do reserve some capital for follow-on investments for the most promising businesses. So it's identifying great entrepreneurs in partnership with regional investors, providing some initial capital, connecting them to our broader Rise of the West network, and helping them scale, accessing talent, establishing partnerships, getting more visibility, whatever it takes to get them to that next stage.
Yeah. Now, I'm sure there might be 100 boxes that companies you'd be looking at, startups you're looking at, that they need to check. But are there 2 or 3 things in particular, Steve, that your seed fund looks for that you genuinely think likely lead to the startup success?
Well, as you said, I could talk specifically about the seed fund. It's different on the later stage funds when they're larger businesses and there's more to essentially diligence, more questions to ask, and more clarity on some of the answers. But the very early stage, you're starting with betting on the idea. Really, is this an idea that is an interesting potential company? Does it solve a real problem? Does it have potentially broad applicability? And the second is the team. It's not just the entrepreneur, it's the team, because we've learned that entrepreneurship is a team sport. And does the team have a diverse mix of perspectives to be successful in that particular industry? For example, if they're focusing on healthcare, does some on the team have experience in healthcare? So that the team aspect would be important. Then some initial evidence that the idea, the product, the service is starting to get some traction. We also really look for partnerships. We've learned over the years, including my years as CEO of America Online, that partnerships really can be accelerators. So they have either existing partners or the possibility of partners that really can take this idea and enable it to scale. And lastly, do they have an investor, because of the nature of what we're doing with Rise of the West, a regional venture investor that really is going to support them and spend meaningful time with them as they scale up, because we only want to do these early investments if we can do alongside trusted partners in these cities.
Is there an example? I know there's a lot of startups that you funded, but is there one in particular, Steve, that you are particularly proud of that just flew, and then maybe another where you're like, oh, what a disappointment, it was such a great idea, it didn't work out?
Well, of course, when you're in this business, there's some things are going to work and some things are not. Sometimes it wasn't a good idea. Sometimes it wasn't the right team. Sometimes the timing wasn't quite right. There's a whole host of reasons. And some examples of some things that worked really well. There's a entrepreneur, Jonathan Webb, who had the idea of building this company called App Harvest that was going to build and did build the largest indoor greenhouse in the country. It's in eastern Kentucky, what some people refer to as Appalachia, what's also known as coal country. It's had a lot of challenges in the last few decades, a lot of job loss. And he said, I'm going to create a company that creates jobs there. And also the process is more sustainable. It uses 90% less water. And their location in eastern Kentucky happens to be 70% of the U.S. population is within a 24-hour drive. So the fruits and vegetables they're growing can get to market more quickly. And that company then went on to be successful, raise significant capital, and now has created more than 500 jobs in coal country, an area that most people really didn't believe in. So that's an example of something that really took a place that most people do not think of as very strong in terms of startups and scale. Another one in Baltimore, Maryland, a company called Catalyte did something really quite fascinating, which is using artificial intelligence to identify talents people have, such as in the area of coding, but didn't know it. Nobody ever talked to them about coding, and if they basically demonstrate this aptitude, they're put through a whole series of courses by Catalyte and then placed in a job. And I remember one of the stories, there was a UPS truck driver who nobody talked to him about coding when he was growing up, but he actually happened to be pretty good at it. And as a result of Catalyte, was able to triple his salary. And so that's an example of identifying talent people have using technology and then giving them the training to have a much better job and a much better future. And so those are some of the stories. As I mentioned in the book, I could have kept writing. It was a couple 100-page book. I could have kept going. We picked, I think it was 30 cities, a little over 40 companies to highlight, but there could have been far more. These are just remarkable stories of entrepreneurs building amazing things and doing it in places that really are surprising to most folks.
Yeah, in reading the book, Steve, I thought, my God, there are so many examples that you were able to cite, and I could just tell you could keep going and going. It would have been a 1,000-page book. You mentioned the ecosystem, and then in the book you talk about a tech ecosystem. And talk a little bit more about what are the ingredients that make for a successful tech ecosystem, and are there any states that you found in particular are strong in that area and deserve more recognition?
Well, there's some states that have emerged in the last few years as stronger in terms of startups. Texas and Florida are two examples. But they historically have not gotten a lot of venture capital. It's sort of surprising to people, but both Texas and Florida get about 2% of venture capital, as opposed to California alone getting about 50% of venture capital. So even there's a big imbalance. But I was recently in San Antonio. There's also a lot of things happening in Dallas and Houston and in Austin. In Florida, we were there with our bus tour, our Eyes of the Rest bus tour a few years ago. And we're in cities like Miami, they get a lot of attention, but also in Orlando, the Tampa St. Pete area is doing quite well. We were also on the Space Coast, which really half a century ago launched this, the Apollo mission. So there's a lot of history there around space technologies, and a lot of new companies now focused on what's called space tech. So there's a couple of states that have a lot of attention. But the biggest story, and then part of the reason to write the book, is how broad-based this was. I think we've now invested in 37 different states, and so a lot of states are emerging with strong kind of startup ecosystems. One of the things that's starting to happen is some of the companies are successful, and then that leads to further success. It's sort of the momentum begets momentum. An example in Indiana, particularly in Indianapolis, there was a company I write about in the book called ExactTarget that was acquired by Salesforce, a Silicon Valley company. Salesforce now has 2,000 employees in Indianapolis, second largest office after San Francisco itself. But because of the success of that company, now there's dozens of other software companies focused on that, because that's what ExactTarget was doing. So it's a momentum begets momentum, kind of dynamic. So as you have more of what we call these tentpole companies, and they're successful, that inspires others to create those companies, has people who have experience building those companies that want to do other things. And also some of those early employees made some money, stock options or other kinds of things, and can invest in the next generation of entrepreneurs. And that acceleration, I think, what we'll see more of in this next decade.
Yeah, I think I remember seeing a whole lot of that outside of Gateway in Sioux City and North Sioux City. It was really phenomenal to watch that. In the book, you note how oftentimes state and local government could be critically important partners when it comes to developing this ecosystem. And I just wondered, is there anything on the federal government side that you have seen which has been, really encouraging to see with respect to support for various tech startups or innovation in a particular area of expertise?
Well, I think everybody has a role to play. Ultimately, it comes down to the entrepreneurs building companies, the investors backing those companies. But there is a role for government, both, as you said, at local and state level, doing a number of things to create the right environment and shift less on economic development as trying to lure a big company to move or open a factory. Instead, try to figure out ways to launch new companies, which is a more sustainable development strategy. At more the national level, there's some things that happened about a decade ago. Congress, in a bipartisan way, passed some legislation called the Jobs Act, the Jumpstarting Our Business Startups Act that I worked on, that updated the laws and securities laws that hadn't changed since 1933. So it wasn't even pre-internet, it was just pre-television. They hadn't changed, to make it easier for entrepreneurs to raise capital, easier for them to go public without some of the full regulations of more mature companies. I think that was a helpful a step. There are also some things that were put in place by President Trump and also working with Congress a few years ago around opportunity zones that helped in terms of regional development. More recently, Congress passed legislation just this past summer, including the CHIPS and Science Act, which put some funding in place for regional hubs, which I think is going to be very helpful to this Rise of the Rest effort. So there's a number of things that have happened and I think will continue to happen. One that still needs some attention, almost got done this summer, is something called the startup visa. How do we continue? And this is, again, what President Reagan talked about so eloquently. How do we continue to be a magnet for people all around the world that want to come here and start companies here and create jobs and drive economic growth here? So that's still some work to be done. But those are some of the things that have happened recently that give me encouragement about what this next phase could be.
Sure. Steve, I read a Fortune magazine article, and part of your interview was about the divide that we're seeing in America, left and right, and I get the sense that you felt that this whole rise of the rest and the conjoining of the Midwest once again with our nation's two coasts might help in that regard. Explain that.
Yeah, no, obviously it's complicated. I don't want to make it seem overly simplistic, and I don't think, the backing entrepreneurs is going to be this magic bullet that unites a divided country. But I think it can help. And the reason I think it can help is part of that divide is over in kind of an opportunity gap where there are people in some places like a Silicon Valley doing really well, and a lot of people, a lot of places really are feeling left out and left behind. They're not really getting the benefit of this innovation. They're not really getting the benefit of in some ways, actually, they're being hurt by it because some of the innovations, the disruptions, people call them, in places like Silicon Valley, an area like robotics technology, are actually destroying jobs in their community. So they're seeing negatives, not positives, from the innovation economy. So that's always going to happen. The sort of technology is always going to kind of have some forward progress. 100 years ago, 90% of us worked on farms. Now it's 2%. And the reason is technology made it easier to grow more food at lower cost with fewer people, which actually is a good thing if you want to feed the world, but was a bad thing in terms of jobs. Thankfully, as a nation, we pivoted and moved people from farms to factories and retrained them for those new jobs and moved from the agricultural revolution to the industrial revolution. We haven't been as effective as we moved to the technology revolution. And I think backing more companies that are creating more jobs is part of the answer. And I should point out, it's not just tech startups. There are many kinds of startups in the food industry, the clothing industry, many different industries that are doing really innovative things, creating lots of jobs. And I have some of those stories in the book. And also, it's not just the company, the jobs creating within these new companies, within these startups. It's the jobs around those companies. And I saw this firsthand when AOL was growing in the Northern Virginia area. It was tons of jobs were being created within the company, but also far more outside of our company because houses were being built and restaurants were being opened and schools were being constructed and so forth. And the data says for every job within a startup, there's 5 other jobs more broadly in the community. So it's not just the jobs you're creating within these companies, it's the broader positive impact it can have on these communities. So that's why I think it can be at least part of the answer to this very difficult question, this divide we have in our nation, by backing more people in more places, creating more jobs and hope and opportunity in more places. I think that strengthens and renews those communities and has the potential, at least in some small way, to help strengthen, renew, and help bridge some of these divides in our country.
Yeah, I really think you're onto something there, Steve. I don't think I would belittle it. If you just take one Senate race, this guy J.D. Vance, who's running there in Ohio against Ryan, and there's a classic case. He's written a book that's essentially about this divide in terms of opportunity and the coasts and the Midwest. So I really think you're right. A couple of questions about China, if I can. You have a terrific, I love the title of this one chapter, United States of Possibility. And, if you square off our system, free enterprise, and just a lot of innovation versus our main competitor, which you see in China, and a top-down centralized system, compare the two for me, if you would. Is there a reason that the innovators are always going to have an advantage over a country like China, or no, do they have such scale that it can defeat our innovation? What do you think about that?
Well, I obviously believe in America and believe in the future of America. I would say that in the last 25 years, China has become much more competitive globally. And initially people thought, well, they'd be good at making stuff, sort of replicating stuff, iPads or cars, what have you, but they wouldn't necessarily be good at building stuff, inventing stuff. And that's actually been changing. And some of the technologies that really are important technologies of the future, they have strong positions in. So I think we need to be careful here. We can't get complacent here. We're seeing the globalization of entrepreneurship. People, not just China, but many countries have figured out that sort of the secret sauce that's made America is this innovative spirit, this entrepreneurial spirit, this pioneering spirit. So they're trying to figure out how to be more innovative, to be more entrepreneurial. And if you look at the venture capital data, this proves this out, that 25 years ago, about 90% of global venture capital was invested in the United States. And now it's less than 50%. So more countries are getting more of that investment. And so that's why you should be careful. At the same time, the reason I'm bullish and optimistic as you are is the American model should be the winning model, that having more decentralized approach to more grassroots approach to innovation as opposed to more of a top-down government, driven approach to innovation should win out. But I think we can only win if we actually are fully taking advantage of that strategy, that grassroots strategy, which gets back to the rise of the rest. If we're only backing or mostly backing entrepreneurs in a few places like Silicon Valley, New York City, Boston, and not all across the country, we're going to have fewer shots on goal, and we're going to try fewer things, and some of the big ideas we'll miss out on, and some other country might be able to lead on them. So we really need to double down on what it has made America, so special, and build on this entrepreneurial spirit, and do that by backing more people in more places that are taking more risks, starting more companies, some of which will struggle and fail because that's the nature of startup, but some of which will be the big Fortune 500 companies of tomorrow, some of which may actually help not just build companies, but build some of the industries of the future. And I think that's the best way to make sure America continues to lead as the most innovative entrepreneurial nation, and we can do it in a more inclusive way.
Yeah, and I really hope that one day Steve Case doesn't have to write The Rise of the Rest -2, with the rest being the rest of the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Versus the United States. Yeah. In fact,
well, interesting you mentioned that. Just one side note is the idea of the rise of the rest is actually something that was first talked about almost 2 decades ago by Fareed Zakaria, the journalist, who was talking about the rise of the rest in a global context, exactly our discussion. He was saying that as some nations like China rose, it would change the global balance of power, which didn't mean America would fall, but would mean these other nations would be strengthened. That's sort of the idea of what we're talking about here, that Silicon Valley will continue to be strong, but it can continue to be strong even if we have a more distributed innovation economy with many entrepreneurs in many cities and many states, all helping to build the future. So that's sort of the idea of the rise of the rest. How do we help these cities, help these entrepreneurs rise up and really pursue the American dream?
Yeah. And on this very subject, I'm going to paraphrase here, but this quote will be close to it. In this chapter, you say, "It's not that China will overtake us, but rather that we will undermine ourselves." Right? It's the enemy. We've met the enemy, and they is us. Right?
Yeah, no, it is challenging, because I think most people I talk to from different parts of the world still look to America for leadership, still look to America with kind of envy, particularly around innovation and on entrepreneurship, but are sort of puzzled that it seems like we can't sometimes get our act together, that sometimes we're focused too much on what divides us and not enough what unites us, and sometimes we can't take some of these global threats as seriously as we should until sometimes it's too late. So hopefully the book I wrote is a little bit of a wake-up call that we need to double down on innovation, entrepreneurship. We need to do it all across the country, not just on the coast. But hopefully people who read it also will end up walking away with sort of an optimistic, we can do this perspective on things, because I really do believe it is doable. We just need to have more focus on it, and not just again on the coast, but all across the country. And if we do that, I think we can continue to lead. Yeah, you bet. A few questions for you more broadly about entrepreneurship and innovation, Steve. I think there's a statistic in your book in which you note that something like 90% of all startups fail. And, there's the old adage, of course, I think it's, 95% of small businesses fail within 2 years. Are those stats true? And if so, it just seems like an incredible downer for somebody who's, starting down the innovation trail, to think that 9.5 or 9.0 times out of 10, you're not going to make it. Well, I think it depends on how you define it. Like many things, it depends on kind of how you ask the question, how you frame the question. In terms of the kind of companies we're talking about, these startups that are backed by venture capital, there are definitely examples where they fail, but there are far more examples where they succeed, because they're able to raise the capital, to build the team, to then build the product or service or the technology that then can really scale. So what we call in the investment world, the loss ratio is quite a bit lower if you can get all those pieces kind of working together. If you're just trying to do something on your own, you don't have access to capital, you either don't have money yourself or you don't know anybody who has money, which is, by the way, true for most people in this country, then it's going to be hard to really take that idea and build the team and be able to make the investments necessary to scale. Sometimes you can. There are many examples of very successful bootstrap companies, but generally at this early stage, the banks won't lend money to you because it's too risky. There's nothing to really kind of lend against. And so you need to figure out some way to access some capital to get started. And that's a way to de-risk what you're doing, because that gives you more of the flexibility to invest, whether it be teams or technology or marketing or whatever it might be. So yes, the nature of entrepreneurship, the nature of startups is risky, and some will fail, but some also will succeed. In my own experience, the first company I joined when I moved to the Washington, D.C. area, Northern Virginia area, actually in 1983, did fail. But two of the people I met there and I then went to start America Online a couple of years later. So out of that failure came a success. And that you hear those stories all the time. One of the great things about entrepreneurs is they tend to be passionate and persistent. So they, even if they stumble, they get back up and keep fighting. They just might have to reframe the fight. Maybe it's a little bit different fight next time.
Yeah, sure. The phoenix from the ashes, and these guys have in serial fashion just keep trying, and then eventually they succeed. Are entrepreneurs, successful entrepreneurs, born or are they made?
Well, there's a big debate on this, and I've been hearing it over the years. And the evidence I have is it's a mix. There are clearly some that are just born with a certain innate interest and aptitude and passion about building things. And I think was one of those, because I always, even at a relatively young age, was in that mode. But there are many examples of very successful entrepreneurs who end up getting to it later in life, sometimes even when they're in their 50s, like Ray Kroc, who basically built McDonald's. He was in his 50s when he basically was selling milkshake mixers. And this group in California, the McDonald's brothers, was ordering a bunch of them. He's like, why are they ordering so many? They seem to be ordering more than most people are. So he visited and saw what they were building, which was essentially one of the first manifestations of fast food. And so this is a great idea, and ended up essentially buying the company and then building the company. He was in his 50s. So there are many. Sam Walton, who started with one store in Bentonville, Arkansas, and just was trying to provide a better way for people in rural areas to get better products at lower cost with greater convenience. He was able to build Walmart, which is now one of the world's largest companies. He also was, I think, in his 40s, 50s when he really was getting going on that. So while there's many examples of people who have born with it, I don't think we should just assume that. We can encourage people, we can inspire people, because at the core, what entrepreneurs do is they see a problem and decide it's an opportunity, and then they do something about it. They see something in their lives. One of the stories I love in the book is a mom in suburban Indianapolis who was worried about water quality. This was a number of years, 5-6 years ago, when Flint, Michigan had a well-publicized water crisis around the drinking water. And so I want to test the water for my family. I'm a little worried my kids are drinking unsafe water. So she called the water company and said, I want to get my water tested. They said, well, we don't do that for people. And she called another company and said, we could do that for you, but it'll cost you several $1,000s. We thought that was crazy, and started this company, 120 Water, that was able to offer that service to consumers for like $50. So it's because she had a problem and she saw it as an opportunity. Another story, Eric Lefkowski in Chicago, his wife sadly was diagnosed with breast cancer about 7 years ago. They talked to different hospitals and kept getting different advice. And was kind of scared by that. He said, this is kind of a data problem. How they should be more precise in understanding exactly what's going on with my wife, and therefore exactly what the best therapy, drug, surgery, et cetera, should be. So he started this company called Tempest that's now growing rapidly. Nearly 2,000 employees. They raised a significant amount of money simply because he saw that problem and decided to do something about it and start a company. This is what America is the engine of innovation that is so great about America, and it's now happening all across the country. And the reason to write the book is most of those stories people don't know about it, and so hopefully we can inspire more, whether they're born or it's become something they learn. They see a problem and they say, I'm going to go do something about it. More people can be part of this, and they can do it now, and increasingly do it in any city in the country.
Yeah. There's so many examples in your book. It really makes you optimistic about the future. I know you have probably sat through thousands of pitches for startups and great ideas. Is there a common mistake that that entrepreneurs might make in pitching to somebody like you?
Well, there's several. One is they don't really get to the point. They don't get what's sometimes called the elevator pitch. What exactly are you trying to build? It's sort of you talk a long time, but it's still not clear what exactly you're doing and why it's different and unique. So that's often a problem. Another is they talk too much about themselves and don't talk about their team. It goes back to what I said before: entrepreneurship being a team sport. We will understand more broadly, what team you have and why you're going to be able to take on this challenge and succeed. Another mistake is saying, well, we don't really have any competitors. We're so unique, we don't have any competitors, which makes me nervous because either it's not a big idea, because if it's a big idea, there will be competitors, or they don't know their competitors, which is concerning, or they do know their competitors, just aren't being honest, which is even more concerning. So that's another one that would get tension. And the last one is entrepreneurs need to be optimistic, need to have this can-do spirit, need to be passionate, need to be persistent, and need to therefore sell their idea and sell their story. But they also have to have a certain degree of humility and understand that some of the positives, but also some of the negatives. Those are the entrepreneurs that we really like backing. They really are excited about the future. It's excited by what they're building, but they're candid and authentic, and also acknowledging some of the challenges they're facing.
Is there still an entrepreneur inside of you just dying to get out? And I know you're as entrepreneurship as it gets when it comes to the funds that you've established and the rest of that. But have you ever sat back and had another AOL idea that you thought, boy, if I could just clear my desk and had the time, I would go do X?
No, well, I certainly thought about that when we did the merger with Time Warner. So over 20 years ago, as part of that, I stepped aside as CEO. I was at the time around 40, so I figured out what was going to do next. Wasn't quite ready to hang it up and just sit on the beach or something. But after I thought about it, I said, maybe the best thing I can do, instead of starting a company that can help many entrepreneurs, and that's what led to starting this investment company, Revolution, and then led to the rise of the rest. And I'm passionate about trying to really create more opportunity for more entrepreneurs, help in the process strengthen these and renew these communities. And as I said before, also help hopefully strengthen the country. So I think it's the best thing I can do, building on my various experiences and the network I have to really be the champion for these entrepreneurs, and also a champion for these cities, and kind of a champion for this country. So rather than do one thing, I'm trying to do that across, by supporting really hundreds of entrepreneurs all across the country.
Yeah. I've got a son who just started at Notre Dame business school, and like him, there's so many others across the nation in school think about business right now. And I'm going to ask you an unfair question. When he graduates, he has a choice. Let's say his choice is he can either go to work for a Fortune 500 and learn the ropes, or nope, he's got a neat idea, and he's got the right friends and investors and the rest of that. Take the risk, go for a startup. Now he has to choose between one of the two. Which is it?
Well, I vigorously pursue both options. I think there is something to be said for getting the experience of working for a large company. That's the first thing I did out of college. I graduated from college and worked for two big companies, Procter & Gamble and PepsiCo, before I entered into the entrepreneurial world. Now, some of that, in fairness, was when I graduated 4 decades ago. Venture capitalists weren't backing 21-year-olds back then, so there's more of access to capital now than there was, back then. And even then, I had the idea of really pursuing the internet. Even when I was graduating from college, I just didn't have a path to do that. And so I thought it would be helpful for me to get some experience that ultimately did put me on the path to be more of an entrepreneur. But today, if your son is graduating and is super passionate about the idea and really believes it's got the right product market fit, and has got other people he knows who also share that passion and share that belief and can figure out a way to access the capital to get started, which in Notre Dame and some other place like that, likely it's easier than there than many other parts of the country. Then I'd give it a shot, because worst case is it fails, but in the process you learned a bunch of things, and either you go on to do join another company, or maybe even go back and join a larger company with a skill set around really doing things with in a scrappy kind of bootstrappy kind of way, that I think those skill sets can then be applied to anything else you might choose to do. So ultimately, everybody has to make their own decision. For some, taking a more kind of traditional corporate path, it might be the answer, either temporarily or perhaps even permanently. For others, the entrepreneurial path may be interesting. For a lot of people, they'll go back and forth. And in this next wave, the people who have some of that big company experience in sectors like healthcare will be even more valuable. But also, these big companies need that innovative, entrepreneurial, pioneering, can-do. Let's figure out kind of scrappy, figure out ways to get to the answer, be more agile and nimble, things like that. So both skill sets are important. So I'm not sure that's going to be necessarily helpful to your son, but I think actively pursuing both paths and then deciding either path you take, there still could be a plan B after that. It's not like you're locked in, and whatever decision you make, you're locked in forever.
Yeah, got it. Do you think, Steve, that entrepreneurs can solve some of society's most intractable problems? Like if you take some of these issues that seem to be perennially on the forefront, crime and homelessness and drug abuse and mental health issues and the rest of that, it seems that society often pushes the most intractable problems to government to address, and they never seem to be addressed, at least in full. I'm just wondering if you think there's a for-profit way to attack these problems successfully, or no, is that a ridiculous road to try to go down?
No, I think there are many entrepreneurs, including some way back, that are dealing with some of those problems. And for example, a lot of innovation happening around construction, housing, particularly focused on affordable housing. There's lots of things around, essentially crime detection and prevention technologies that can be used to give police force, in this case, the better tools to create safer communities. There's a lot of focus on things related to healthcare. We have a healthcare system that we still have work to do. We need to make sure that we really are providing better outcomes with more convenience at lower costs. And I think that requires innovation. Not all that will come from entrepreneurs, but a lot of that will come from entrepreneurs, like the one I mentioned earlier, Tempest. And we back many other entrepreneurs, focusing on this. So I don't want to make it sound like the business world, the private sector, particularly the entrepreneurial world, it's going to solve every problem in the world. But I think the perspective they bring is helpful, and they can solve parts of the problem that can result in, I think, safer, healthier communities and a safer, healthier country. So unleashing more of that entrepreneurial spirit in more people, in more places, is part of what we're trying to do with Rise of the Rest.
Got it. Corporate culture. We talked earlier about the changes we're seeing in business, where people are located remotely, work from home, office, etc. Can you envision, Steve, starting, whether it be AOL or another major corporate success that we've seen in the past, and being able to build that culture when people aren't there, when you don't have a headquarters necessarily, or people are coming in and out, and you might see, teammates once a month as opposed to once a day. How do you build a corporate culture successfully if everyone is scattered across the nation?
No, I think it is hard, and there's some companies that have started, and we back some of them that are fully remote, so all their employees are remote, and they're very intentional when they get started. How do they put technologies in place that do allow for collaboration? How do they have frequent meetings, in-person meetings, offsite, things like that, to get people together? But I do, to your question, I do think that most companies are not going to be fully remote. They're either going to be fully in the office or kind of a hybrid structure where they're in the office sometimes and working remote other times. And it really ties into the point you made. How do you not just focus on productivity but creativity? How do you focus on building a team culture? How do you avoid the dynamic of some people feeling left out, kind of like the Hamilton play? They're not in the room where it happened. So there are some dynamics to mention. And I also should note that about 60% of the population in terms of workers can never be remote. They're working on on airplanes or working in restaurants or working in hospitals or delivering packages, things that are going to require being in person all the time. And so we need to be more respectful of that, not just assume that every job is remote is a possibility. And we also need to think, what are the right ways to organize in this new world to capitalize on some of these opportunities and be flexible and tap into some people that maybe have a certain skill set that you don't have in your particular company, and they can be available to be a consultant or some other way to tap into that, while at the same time building a strong culture. And I also would note that in these rise the rest cities, where we've invested now in over 100 different cities, and they tend to be more in the middle of the country. Those people tend to also be working together more frequently than some of the companies we've backed on the coast. They see the value of being together. They typically have shorter commutes, which is one of the benefits of many of these rise to rest cities. And so as a result, they're also able to get to their work by not necessarily having to use mass transit, which particularly during the pandemic created more risk and made more people who relied on that more nervous about coming into the office. A lot of things are happening. I think it's in some ways like a shake the snow globe moment for the world, for our society. We've been through a lot in the last few years. How is it all going to settle out? How is it going to change things? Nobody knows for sure, but I'm pleased that it created a level of flexibility that gives people more choice in terms of where they want to live and how they want to work. And that is helpful to what we're trying to accomplish in terms of broadening out the innovation economy, supporting more entrepreneurs in more places.
Just a couple last questions. Social media. Steve, as you noted, you were one of the critically important people early on with the internet, and you can see what's happened over the years now. Yeah, I mean, every individual on the planet with a piece of technology in their hand now seems to have become a publisher and a net. How do you think that social media and the rise of the internet has helped, but also in some respects harmed society?
Well, I'd say it's a mixed bag, but net, I think it has been a big positive in terms of some of the ways that we can learn and more access to education for people in areas around the country or areas around the world that didn't have access to that, more access to information, more access to products and services that could be ordered more conveniently and at better prices, more choices in terms of entertainment, more choices in terms of investing, a lot of different things that are positive. So I think it's been mostly a positive. But I agree with your point, which is there are also some negatives. And so any new technology, any new innovation, how do you maximize the positives and minimize, sort of hedge against some of the negatives? And with social media in particular, I was a big advocate in those early days of, we didn't call it social media back then, we called it community. We said, let's create an electronic community that brings people together, not just people you already know, but people you don't yet know, but should know because they have some shared interest. And that really was the first wave of the internet, the first wave of community-based services. More recently, as it's become even more broad-based, and some of the companies have been using algorithms to decide what information people are going to see based on a whole series of ingredients. And also, as we as a people have tended to kind of live in our own little, what some people call filter bubbles, not just with the internet, but also cable television, just watching, stations that or with viewpoints that agree with us, just following people on Twitter or Facebook that agree with us. I think that's unfortunate. I think you can disagree with somebody, but at least you have to understand the other side of the argument. And so I'm hopeful in this next phase, we'll get back to sort of a better place with social media, where there will be more of a benefit of a free exchange of ideas, more voices, as opposed to what we have today. That has been one of the unfortunate, unintended consequences of the internet, particularly of social media.
Yeah. Last question, Steve. Way off topic from the book, but I just think a good one given the unique role you play. I know that you're presently the chairman of the Smithsonian Institution. Wow, what a job. Can you just talk about your role and the importance of that role, and the Smithsonian and all organizations that contribute to America's attic and all those things?
Well, it's an amazing institution. It's 176 years old as we first opened the Smithsonian. And the original idea was the increase in diffusion of knowledge, and that's still our focus. Now we have 21 museums, national views, significant research operations around the country, indeed around the world, and it's really become an amazing platform that really is the pride of America and the envy of the world. So the focus in the last few years, certainly as I've been the chair of it, is how do we become more innovative, entrepreneurial, agile as an organization, even though we now have a considerable scale? How do we become more collaborative? How do we partner more within the various parts of the Smithsonian, but also partner with other organizations, museums, research operations, media companies, et cetera, so we can have more impact together than we could have just on our own? And how do we become more digital? How do we not just assume people are going to come visit us, fly to Washington, D.C., come to the National Mall to visit the Air and Space Museum or the Natural History Museum or the American History Museum, but we can go to them, and we want the Smithsonian to be in every home and every classroom. So that requires us to have more of a digital view of kind of leaning into the future. So those are some of the areas that we're focused on. And from the book, both the beginning of the book and the end of the book talks about this theme, including my role with the Smithsonian, because in 4 years, America is going to celebrate its 250th birthday. And the Smithsonian is going to be playing a central role in it. I happened to be in Washington, D.C. as a teenager when America celebrated its 200th birthday in 1976. And that's when the Air and Space Museum was opened for the first time. We reopened part of it just a couple of weeks ago. We'll be reopening the rest in time for that. And my hope, and it ties in with this book and what we've been talking about with entrepreneurship and innovation, the American spirit, that when we do celebrate our 250th birthday in 4 years, it's not just the Smithsonian stepping up to play a leadership role, but in the process, we've really lifted up many parts of the country and created more of these jobs and hope and opportunity in these places that have been left out and left behind. So it's a great honor to serve as chair of the Smithsonian. It's a unique organization. We have citizen regions, we have congressional regions, we have the vice president, we have the chief justice of the Supreme Court are all on what's called the board of regions. So it's a great honor to be part of that and currently to be chair of that. And how do we build on our 176-year history as the country builds on its 246-year history as we head to this next great celebration in 4 years?
Yeah, just magnificent, really. Congratulations on that, Steve. Well, what a contribution this book is. And, frankly, your entire career and the contributions you've made to this nation, Steve, just magnificent. And I can't tell you how much of an honor it's been to just spend an hour with you. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, John. Great to be with you. And thanks for everybody tuning in. And hopefully some of the ideas here, because of that optimistic can-do American spirit, are things that Ronald Reagan would also have appreciated. He certainly talked about many of these ideas for many years, long before I did. So it's a great honor to be with you, John. A great honor to be speaking, at least virtually, at the Reagan Library. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this book and talk about what could be this next great chapter in the American story.
You bet. Thanks so much, Steve.
Thank you for joining us for today's virtual programming event. We hope this conversation has inspired you to share what you've learned with your family and friends, and that you'll join us again for an upcoming event.
And let me offer lesson number 1 about America. All great change in America begins at the dinner table. So tomorrow night in the kitchen, I hope the talking begins. And children, if your parents haven't been teaching you what it means to be an American, let them know and nail them on it. That would be a very American thing to do.